I'm Bob Girrier, President of Pacific Forum, and welcome to today's discussion on critical thinking in an age of strategic competition, navigating information and influence. Before we begin, I'd like to give you a few words about our organization, Pacific Forum. We're a private, nonprofit, nonpartisan foreign policy research institute established in 1975 and now in our 45th year of operation. Our vision is to contribute to peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific by conducting policy-relevant research, promoting dialogue, and mentoring the next generation. We research, connect, and inform. And now to our topic. We're well into a global information age, and now, too, an era of strategic competition. The Indo-Pacific will figure centrally in this new era, and critical thinking and assessment skills will become essential for people, businesses, and countries to thrive freely as they consume information and seek level playing fields in which to operate. Assistant Secretary of State David Stilwell will address this trend and how it's affecting the future of the Indo-Pacific. How do we successfully navigate the nexus of information, influence, and manipulation? David Stilwell is the Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Prior to his appointment as Assistant Secretary, he served in the Air Force for 35 years. He served multiple tours of duty in Japan and Korea as a linguist, a fighter pilot, and a commander. He also served as a defense attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. Most recently, Mr. Stilwell served as a director of the China Strategic Focus Group at U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, and also as an adjunct senior fellow at the East-West Center in Honolulu. He speaks Korean, Chinese, and Japanese. A note, this evening's session will be recorded. All remarks, including those during our Q&A session, are on the record. We're delighted to have you with us this evening, Assistant Secretary Stilwell, to share your perspectives. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, sir. And I know I asked you for this favor to allow me to sort of offer views on how we get out of this position of being ideological herbivores. I picture us since 1991 as out in a beautiful open field on a sunny blue sky day, grazing away at soft, tender blades of grass without a care in the world and no thought of any carnivores or predators out there, but they're out there. And in the last 3 or 4 years, we've actually taken a role and acknowledged that and tried to decide how we're going to steel ourselves for the great power competition that is to come. It was obvious to me in 2012 in Beijing when the 18th Party Congress, when Xi Jinping arrived, that he was going to give us a run for our money. Americans love to compete. We do well and we do better when we're actually engaged in competition than not. So we have characterized this relationship as a strategic competition, acknowledging the reality. We certainly didn't turn up the temperature of the water. We've been cooperating while the other side had been competing, and therefore the relationship was truly one of competition. So we're simply acknowledging the obvious. And what today I want to talk about is what isn't so obvious, but should be, and I hope it is soon enough, is steeling ourselves in many ways. My focus is on education, is getting us to think again in terms of critical thinking, maybe a healthy cynicism or skepticism of what you read, whether it is on social media or whether it's Chinese media that's broadcasting ideas to us freely while we are blocked out of the PRC. So Francis Fukuyama in 1991, I think, was correct. It is truly the end of history. These authoritarian systems didn't pan out, but the Chinese are bent on trying again. And it's already clear based on what we've seen that model is not as resilient as a process or the governance system like democracy that takes the intent, the voices, and the feelings of its people to heart. So I'm going to talk a little bit about all of that here in a little bit. One of the differences, I talk about the competition, and it's a pretty solid competition in the economic sphere. In the military sphere, it's becoming greater, and I know Bob Girrier can speak more to that. But I look at areas where we have advantage, and our greatest advantage is our free and open system that understands the importance of diversity and cultivates ideas that don't necessarily comport those at the top. And by that, we become better. And by listening to the ideas of others, we get better. And so this is a battle of ideas. It's a battle of ideas on social media. battle of ideas in this, overall global competition between the U.S. and the PRC. And I would say, though, it's not just the U.S., it's all like-minded countries, democracies, and others. That's our greatest advantage. The second one is that we have like-minded eyes and partners. But today I want to talk about our greatest advantage is the fact that we can criticize, and we're encouraged to criticize, to think critically and freely. So slide, please. Pushing slides.
Yep.
All right, well, I'll talk to you about slides and they'll catch up. The opening slide, great critical thinking in an era of great power competition. Bob, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, sure thing.
Okay.
And we'll get your slide here in a second.
Yeah, no worries. So the first slide basically talks about our strategy in an era of dealing with PRC influence. There you go. By putting up the Great Firewall, the PRC is able to limit the information people get. That's primarily a detriment, but it does have advantages in great power competition. They can pretty much tell their people what they want to hear. And so, and at the same time, our open system allows them free reign to push their ideas to us freely. One of the things we've done in this job is to, since I got here, is to designate the obvious Chinese media organizations, CGTN, China Global Television Network, and others, as what they are is a foreign they're just like the embassy. And so our first job is to identify this problem and call it out in every sphere. The second one is distinguishing our concerns about malign Chinese activity and the otherwise helpful, beneficial, and close mutual ties we have with the Chinese people. PRC has made an effort to make this a racial argument, where they say the U.S. Is oppressing Chinese people and doesn't like Chinese people. That nothing could be further from the truth. This is why you heard the language from this administration change last summer to actually distinguish between the Communist Party and what it does and the Chinese people. No more will you hear China is doing this, right? We're picking our words better because it matters. Now, the third bullet is to encourage PRC engagement in international organizations in accordance with globally accepted norms and shared values. And we can just leave it like this. It doesn't have to be pretty, but they can, of course, they can operate in the UN and the WHO, World Health Organization, all that stuff, but they have to comport and comply with the things they signed up for. So, and then the last thing in this strategy is to amplify our leadership, to take more credit for what we've done and to show all the things that we've done. Let me give you an example. With the World Health Organization, we got notified, or the language is that the U.S. pulled out and therefore has pulled all funding from the World Health Organization. Nothing could be further from the truth. In the last 10 years, we've invested upwards of $100 billion in public health, in things like PEPFAR, counter AIDS, counter Ebola. We're up to 11 billion so far in countering the coronavirus. And so the Chinese, though, have had an outsized voice in this, and they've been able to tell the world that the U.S. is not supporting it. Only China is actively engaged. Their contributions to this are a pittance. Slide, please. Next slide talks about countering these influence operations. And so I'm going to give you examples of what a PRC disinformation campaign looks like. So maybe to help you identify what it looks like. We have to recognize propaganda for what it is and its source. Its source is the Central Committee of the Communist Party and the Propaganda Department, in conjunction with the United Front Work Department. And so their job is to take what we do and spin it using some really nice logical errors, which I'll show you, in order to, again, send the message that the U.S. is, I'll give you a few examples, is disinterested, is isolationist, is leaving the region, is petty, and all the rest of that. This is all the language that came out of the first period of Xi Jinping reign. And it's only gotten worse. So ways we can get at it, I think, are one that I thought was perfect was the hometown diplomat. Excuse me, give me some drink. Hometown diplomat. It was an old U.S. information agency program where we would send people back to their hometowns And then they would talk about what life is like overseas, what life in U.S. government is like, explain government policy and all those things. This is my first try at hometown diplomat, seeing as Honolulu is my hometown. And my goal is to, again, engage with you all. Eventually, I want to engage with the schools or the school boards or other things. I had some good interaction with the Department of Education here recently on getting undue Chinese influence out of our classrooms, and we know it's there. Other Department of State activities can help us with this process as we reach out to education. And higher education, as you know, is already receiving pretty good scrutiny on their accepting of funding without reporting it. There was probably the thing that broke that open was a chemistry professor at Harvard who was accepting something like $50,000 a month from the PRC and then wasn't reporting it, one, and then of course there were other activities that are of interest. So look, our classrooms should be apolitical and they should not be a place for the PRC to have its way. And so that's one of my goals. Slide, please. So on education, we're looking to, I mean, there's a lot of interagency interest in these things. And again, you're just seeing the beginning of it. There'll be more and more of this as we start to weed out this United Front work activity. If you want to see a good example of what it looks like, a clear painting, read the book Silent Invasion by Clive Hamilton. I think that will, again, spell it out pretty clear. Good thing I have backup copy here. We talked about Confucius Institutes, Confucius classrooms, the same thing, but they are in our elementary schools, in our secondary schools. So that's something we should probably get at. Talked about their reach back. A lot of funding a lot of schools have become dependent on Chinese funding, not just Chinese students, but Chinese grants and other things. And then they're going to tell you that there's no substitute available, but we can find ways to still do open and free education without accepting undue influence. If you don't know, the PRC is pretty active, probably not in Honolulu so much because there's no consulate nearby. But if you read a piece in the Economist magazine called 1843 from 2017 called Alienation 101, it really paints a good picture of what the Consul General in Chicago does when he's interacting with students, Chinese students at the University of Iowa, and other things. And so there is a lot of outreach with these schools, with the Chinese diplomatic corps into our schools. And so we took steps in September of last year to not limit it, just build awareness, understand it better, and a step toward opening up our access to similar education activities in the PRC, which we currently don't have. Let's see, and then state-sponsored collection. You probably heard Mill-Sid Fusion, you probably heard Thousand Talents. These are all very smart programs. I mean, I, in many ways, blame ourselves for not being aware of those things, paying attention to these more. Slide. All right. I know people wince when we raise the memories of the USSR in the Cold War, and I don't want to make that comparison here, but I do want to point out that much of what we did to counter Soviet propaganda, we need to start doing again, recognizing disinformation, misinformation. Social media is wide open. I mean, in the past, if you got a copy of Pravda or read or watched a broadcast from TASS, you knew who it was, and you could tell the heavy, stodgy writing made it clear who you were talking to. It's not the case anymore. I mean, a lot of the stuff the Chinese are doing in social media is hard to identify. So those are things of interest. We'll accelerate here a little bit. Slide. And so one of the things I'd like to see done in schools more, and I'm not totally informed on this, but I do think we should start looking at things like logical fallacies, teaching critical thinking. The Chinese use multiple logical fallacies. They'll paint a picture of something, wait for the slide. They'll paint a picture of something that makes perfect sense until you do a little critical thinking, and all of a sudden you realize that's false premise, that's a false choice, that's a hasty generalization, that's an ad hominem attack. I mean, you see all of these on a daily basis, weak analogy, et cetera. You see these coming out of the PRC media on a daily basis. So slide. So I had some examples for you to look at. This one, not this one. Don't go to this one. Keep going. There you go. Thank you. That one just takes too much to load. But the next slide is a sample of what you would call propaganda. And that's the, that's okay, we'll let that build. But when you get a chance, go to the next slide. Disinformation, the first one is a Global Times piece. The Hu Xijin is the editor of Global Times. He has a Twitter account. Of course, Twitter's not authorized in China, but he still uses it a lot. And he uses it a lot to throw things out there to get people thinking, to dissuade people or divert people's attention. So the photo, when we get to it, depicts the hasty generalization. To the right of it, you'll see a picture of the Secretary of State making a statement about how the coronavirus, the origins of the coronavirus and other things. And under that, they have a picture called, it says liar. That's pretty blatant and unfortunate. There are a couple other examples here of a red herring, straw man. I'm going to leave that we'll forward you the slides and you can look at them as you go. The second to last slide is a photo of, okay, there you go. Again, we keep going. This next one's kind of important. Okay, back. There you go. On the left is what you recognize as propaganda, right? Raymond Ribal from Storm the Barricades, right? This is Mao Zedong during the Cultural Revolution, telling them, giving them orders. On the right, though, is a current example of what you saw on the left. This is a page out of The Economist. And just look at it, I showed that to some of my surfing buddies out there at Sandy Beach, and they're going, yeah, that looks like normal stuff. If you now click, if you blow it up and look at it and read some of the text in the beginning, it says things like Xi Jinping thought is a wonderful thing, and then we should follow it, and Corona is being handled perfectly, and all the rest. And at the top, the advertisement banner kind of throws you off. The bottom, Beijing Review does, but again, Americans just aren't really looking for these things, and so they read this and they take it as gospel. It's not just the Chinese; everybody does it, but the Chinese are actually pushing a message that undermines what we're trying to do. Slide. And so, hometown diplomat, we got our folks back. We're starting to reconstitute our embassies overseas and such, but they're still here. I want to use them while they're here to go out and talk about these things. I'm actively talking to the education department, as well as academic institutions, school boards, and the like. I'd like to talk a little bit about language skills, if you guys are interested, that we should then go back to looking at what strategic languages look like. STEM education in schools is important. This virtual format actually works out pretty well. We've gotten used to this. I was hoping to do this live in person, but it takes a lot of time and it's expensive. So this is a nice backup. It's not the same, but it'll work. And then I got to figure out where to start. I'll leave that as an open question for you all as I open it up for questions. Where do we start? Teachers, classrooms, government, think tanks, over.
Okay, super. Does that conclude your comments, Secretary? Okay, thank you so much. Just to review, and we have this cycling on the very beginning of the event. To ask a question or comment, please use the raise hand function that's located on the participants tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Just wait to be called, and we'll unmute you, and then we'll go ahead and have you speak. Please state your name, your affiliation, and position before asking your question. And I'd also ask, in the interest of time, just to be as succinct as you possibly can. There's an alternate method also, and you can send your questions via the moderator using the chat function. So both the raise hand feature and the chat function are good ways to go. Let me just go ahead and kick this off with an initial question, if I might. And just asking Assistant Secretary Stilwell, I think you talked a little bit about it in the very beginning, but what is your single biggest advice to those who follow the news and consume information, whether it's the Indo-Pacific or globally for that matter?
Multiple sources, don't just depend on one. I think this is the thing that's got my generation kids, when I send them notes, they ignore them because it doesn't fit in neatly with what they're reading from their single source. My son talks about Reddit a lot, and he gives the impression that that actually does compile multiple perspectives. But when I was at the Army War College, we did a traveling tour similar to what this is. We went to universities, and the main message from all of us was: don't believe everything you read. Be skeptical. Look for good sources. I used to advertise The Economist and others, but unfortunately, lots of what should be objective resources seem to be taking a more political spin. I don't know what's causing that. I mean, a lot of Fox News versus CNN. We know each represents a certain perspectives, but BBC, I think, is still pretty solid. Again, I'll defer to you guys where you go for your data, your information, to understand, the whole picture vice what someone's trying to tell you. It seems like every news article right now is an op-ed. That's really sad.
Super. Okay, I've got a question coming in from Ichiro Fujisaki. His question is regarding the wolf warrior diplomacy. I think if we can unmute him, he might have more to follow on that.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Secretary Stilwell. That was a very clear explanation. My questions sounds a bit maybe cynical or sarcastic, but I think the best friend United States or Japan has is this clumsiness of Chinese propaganda. As Joe Nye says, the best propaganda is not propaganda, but wolf warrior diplomacy. Too aggressive Chinese propaganda is not getting any friend in United States here or Europe or many places, because with COVID-19, we know that they're sending a lot of materials, but people are not very gratifying if you're asked to be grateful. And do you think, can we continue to count on this very malcalculated, very bad diplomacy of China to continue, because they are trying to just look at buying the favor of the big boss, and not in democracy, not in where the media is. That kind of diplomacy may continue, but how do you view this? Am I clear?
Very clear. Yeah, very clear. My number one goal in this job is messaging. A lot of people ask me, that seems kind of tame, but we have not done a very good job of telling our story. Like I said, $100 billion, it's actually more than that over the last 10 years in public health investment globally. That it took us 3 months to actually scrape together that number as we reached out to USAID and all these others. And it wasn't nefarious or anything like that. It's just that we don't like to brag. And so we want to tell our story better. At the same time, because we're doing that, I think it's made it more difficult for the PRC to allow our message to stand alone, and so they want to counter it. The normal propaganda, like I showed that Renmin Rubao, People's Daily Headline, I think they realized wasn't cutting it, and so they wanted to venture into the new world of social media, like Twitter, not Weibo, and they went to try Twitter. And a guy named Zhao Lijian, who was the DCM, the deputy in Pakistan, started that. If you remember last July, he and Susan Rice got into it over a question of race in the US. And man, you're just going, dude, don't go there. And he walked right into it. And he, again, completely uninformed, had no idea what he's talking about. He's calling her names. And I know, again, if you haven't seen it, you need to go back, just look at July, the Chinese DCM and Susan Rice. Since then, but I think he got a lot of hits. And so because it seemed like those hits weren't complimentary, they were like, what the heck? The feedback is that it's working. And so, as you say, the more shrill, the more accusative, the more outlandish, putting a big liar in front of the Secretary of State, more ad hominem, gets lots of shares and likes and stuff, but it's for the wrong reasons. I think it's working well for us. The last point on that is in the information age, you can't put up a giant cyber firewall and cut yourself off from global information and cut your people off from that information. I don't think there's a feedback loop, so they don't get the point that this is not going over well. Don't interrupt your adversary while they're in the middle of making a mistake. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that question. I've got another one here from Terence Matsuo. He asks, South Korean media reported that the ambassador Lee Soo-hyuk told reporters that since South Korea has been invited to the next G7 summit, it has reached the point where it can choose either the US or China. What areas do you expect South Korea to choose, China instead of the US?
Someone asked Morgan Ortegas this question, the spokesperson for the State Department. Yeah, I thought she phrased it pretty well. Korea made a choice back in the 80s. I mean, that's the choice. They chose democracy. This is not a choice of China. You can work with both the U.S. and China, but you also have to consider your own national character. And again, most countries have moved to a system of democratic governance for the right reasons, because it's more stable. It takes advantage of the benefits of the population's thinking. Again, voting and letting people be heard allows them to buy in and support versus resist, as we saw in Hong Kong and other places. And so, yeah, I don't like the discussion about whether you have to choose between the US or China. I mean, you have to choose your own national system. And if you choose democracy, then you made the right choice.
Thank you. I've got one more I'll pick up here on the chat, then I'll swing over to raised hands. But this one comes from Rob Chambers from U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. He asks, how do we compete when CCP uses all major U.S. hosted social media, Facebook, Twitter, as well as their pernicious TikTok, but the U.S. does not have equal access to the Chinese market? So how do we deal with that? How do we compete?
Thanks, Rob. Easy. Well, no, it's not easy. In the end, we advocate and we tell the Chinese when we interact that you should allow your people to have access to information, and they should be able to decide for themselves. One thing we do is the embassy has a website when it's up and running that the Chinese people can visit. But here's another problem with the social credit score plan. The sites you visit are used against you. So if you're looking at sites that they would prefer you don't, U.S. Embassy website or others, it's a disincentive to do that. That's just, the people are going to get the information. Information is like water; it's going to go where it goes, and they will hear. And the Chinese people are very inventive and very creative. I mean, these are the people who came up with the term May 35th. You couldn't say the June 4th anymore. And so the information gets there, and it's just how it gets there. The fact, when it has to make its way, the hard way through barbed wire and all that to get to you, they actually believe it more, because it works against you when you're hiding it. The question is, why are you preventing them from seeing that? So I do believe the information is getting through. It'd be fair that the Chinese people don't give them the same access that the same Twitter that the government uses.
Thank you. I'll go now to the raised hands here. I've got Robert Blum. If you could again state your affiliation, Robert.
Yes. I'm Robert Blum, spelled B-L-O-H-M. I'm an economist. I spent a decade in Beijing up until 2015 when it got unbearable. I'm an occasional contributor to PACnet, have been over those years. I was a student of Robert Mundell, father of supply side economics and so on. On this issue of logical fallacies, I have an anecdote to convey to you that can sort of deepen that observation and the importance of it. I arranged in 2011. 2011 is just before the window closed from the Who era, which was scientific thinking, to the She era, which is politics is primary, science is secondary. I arranged for the world's leading philosopher of science, the living philosopher of science. His name is Mario Bunge, B-U-N-G-E. He's a philosopher physicist. He was a protege of Karl Popper, the father of critical thinking. He came to Beijing to give lectures at the Institute of Marxism at Beijing University. He also lectured at the Central Party School at the philosophy department, basically trashed dialectical materialism. He said Marxism, that part of Marxism is just nonsense. Get rid of it. And we had a luncheon there. You know, Xi Jinping used to run that school. And I asked him casually, do you have somebody who teaches logic? Like, do you have a logic professor? They say, actually, we don't. We haven't given a logic course. We're talking about fundamental logic course, fallacies and so on. We haven't had a logic professor here for several years. We can't find one. So that's, you know, it's as rudimentary as that. Language teaching in China, Chinese, English, you get it. It's deficient because students are not taught how to give information, how to write. They're taught how to read. They memorize classics. They're not taught grammar. They're not taught how to construct thoughts or ideas. And so they're very poor at organizing information. And when these students come here at our graduate schools, we're too lax in their command of English, but it's not just English, their ability to write. In areas like economics, they can't write papers and so on. They just don't know how to organize information. And it's part of this problem where logic was neglected. Another thing that's pernicious is in this dialectical materialism, they plant the idea, what they call the law of contradiction, not the law of non-contradiction, like, you know, something and its opposite cannot be true. They implant that something and its opposite can be true at the same time. What that does is it develops a tolerance for anything you want, you know, for poor thinking and so on. So that kills the critical approach at the outset. So I just wanted to, you know, bring it. Oh, fine. I have a final sentence. I've been dying to ask you, are you related to General Joseph Stilwell? Thanks.
I am.
Thanks.
Our family tree diverged 200 years ago in 1799. Same family, but we were poor dirt farmers in South Dakota.
Thanks for your feedback, Robert. I'm going to move on to Melissa Horowitz, a raised hand here. We'll unmute you, Melissa, if you could just tell us your affiliation, and please try to shape your comment as succinctly as possible.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. Thank you for your patience. I'm a student at the U.S. National War College here in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for tonight's discussion. Your description of Chinese behavior shows that global competition in influence information seems here to stay. I wonder if you could give us a sense of how the U.S. government is organizing itself more broadly to compete in information and influence globally and against China. Thank you.
We, a whole bunch of ways. Just give you one example, the Global Engagement Center. I wish we could see you and we could talk. So I would ask you, have you heard of this? Global Engagement Center is designed to get after disinformation. And I think the original impetus was the 2016 election. May have been before that, but it was before that actually. But the great power aspect was the manipulation of social media, the trolling and all those things that you know, had the great potential to skew the election from outside of the U.S. And so, I mean, an active debate inside the U.S. is what we desire, but we can't really have others that are moving the needle in their own direction. So the point is to understand what it looks like. That's sort of the basis. The basis of this brief, though, was engaged with the Global Engagement Center as we were getting ready to go talk to the Secretary of Education and talk about what she's doing, Leah Gabriel, on this. And so she's been public on that as well. She gave a pretty good presentation maybe 3 weeks ago to the bullpen here in the State Department. And again, that's one example, but I still think it's still early. There's lots more we could do. If you recall, I mentioned earlier on, the U.S. Information Agency's job was to do this, was to handle great power disinformation. I'm a product of the East West Center. I understand Richard Volstek is online somewhere. So even Richard, that's where I got my master's degree and found my wife. So it was a really good, it wasn't propaganda. It was basically, it's like APCSS today. It brings people together in Holly Manoa and in the process allows each to exchange information and better understand each other's culture, while at the same time helping people who would ordinarily be critical of the U.S. to get experience firsthand, and often, most of the time, went back with a different opinion. Education is another great way. ECA, Marie Royce is the secretary for the Education and Culture group here, bureau here in the State Department. So I work very closely with them. They're moving out on this as well. Again, still nascent, but growing. That's a good question. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm going to switch back to the chat. I've got, looks like Ambassador Jim Moriarty. A note in his chat question is, Taiwan seems to have gotten much better at countering Chinese disinformation over the past year. Are there lessons we can learn from what they have done, both in terms of tweaking legislation and rapidly responding to misinformation?
Jim, that's a good question, and I hadn't actually thought about it. My entire focus with Taiwan in the last 5 months has been their magnificent handling of Corona. Nick Schifrin and PBS NewsHour did a piece on Taiwan's handling of that. As soon as they got wind of it, they sent people to Wuhan and said, as soon as they went there, they go, there's a big problem here. That was in December. They went back and shut their borders and stuff. That's because they understood the threat. So your point is very valid. They would be a good source of understanding what that misinformation looks like, identifying the sources, and then demonstrating how to address that. So we'll see if we can maybe follow up.
Thank you. And I've got a raised hand here from Bill McKinney. We'll unmute you, Bill, if you could just state your affiliation and fire away your question.
Hey there, sir. Mr. Secretary, welcome.
Hey, Bill.
I really wanted to, I'll have a question for you, but I'd like to give you a weather report. China Beach are about 1 to 3 at the moment on the surf. Probably will go above 5 with the winds coming in. And you don't have to wear a tie
You're killing me. Keep going. I can hear you.
on White Beach. Actually, though, the question I have for you there, sir, is, as you're well aware, there are a number of people, East Asia hands, who are concerned about the PRC returning. That's good. That's good. Do you have those made in bulk to give out to everybody there, sir?
My excuse.
I see. Anyway, going back to my question, was that a number of East Asia hands believe the PRC might be returning to its old hegemonic ways. I'm not sure that how you believe, how you stand on this, or how you see U.S. policy addressing it. But those are my questions of there. How does the U.S. counter this threat from the PRC?
It's a great question and a fairly simple answer. The answer is yes. And I mean, I agree with them. I mean, as their economy grew and their influence in the world grew and their overall, they say, comprehensive national power grew, they would, of course, ask for a greater voice in how things operate in their near abroad in the region, and then obviously globally in multilateral institutions like the UN and the rest. And so, you know, in Chinese, the word hegemony, ba, is sort of a pejorative. I guess it's not a happy word in the US either, but it's what you do, right? If you have the ability to influence things to your benefit, then you can be excused for doing so, but in such a way that comports with the existing system. And this is where the Thucydides trap idea was a stroke of genius on their part. Talk about disinformation. Is they use our own historical analogy from the Peloponnesian Wars to tell us that as the rising power, China is going to require more space and you, the US, need to clear out, or there'll be war. I mean, I give them great credit for having enough, getting people to actually buy into that argument. I don't buy that argument. You know, there's no reason we can't continue to do what we do and protect our interests in South China Sea and the West Pacific and all those. Bob Girrier did that very well for his time in the service, and still coexist with the Chinese. But it's a negotiation. It's not like you're going to say, hey, we're the new kid in town, you guys beat it. It doesn't work that way. And so they would then say, oh, so you're suggesting we have to fight it out. No, we don't. there will be an accommodation of some sort that works. But look, we believe that the current global order it has provided, at least in the Asia Pacific, 70 years of stability that allowed China not to be fighting wars or whatnot, allowed it to build its economy and gain all that strength. And so we would hope that they would appreciate that system and allow that system to continue. There are indications that they see it otherwise. So I think, in short, the 19th Party Congress work report made it pretty clear that China expects to move closer to the center of the global stage. And since then, they've made statements that even make it more explicit that China wants to resume its place in the world. We don't have a problem with that, but there is a system in place right now, and just because you're a new kid on the block, we're not all going to change to adapt.
Thank you. I've got a raised hand here from Catherine Pongonis. We'll unmute you, Catherine, if you could state your affiliation and your question.
Good morning, sir. I had a question about our efforts on civil-military fusion. I know that there's been some comments from the podium and others, and that we're starting to formulate a strategy where we'll work hand in hand with our public diplomacy colleagues. Are you able in this forum to make any comments on where we're going on countering civil-military fusion efforts by the PRC, please?
Sure, awareness, it's pretty easy. But Zhongmin Ronghe, I think is the term. The mighty Chad Sabragia, if anybody knows him, was the first to really say, hey, there's more here. We need to look at this. And so he's done quite a bit of work on that. He's DASD for China over in the Pentagon right now. Used to be in the SFG. Shout out to all the SFG folks. Dr. Dave, I hear you're out there, so wave to you. Dave Dorman's probably the best guy to answer that question. But as far as policy, as far as dealing with civil fusion, MILSA fusion, it's kind of what I'm doing here. It's just, thanks, Lucas, is making people aware that it exists. That's really the major defense here is to understand that PLA officers studying at MIT and Georgia Tech and other places, I think I'm okay with that if a U.S. military officer was allowed to study at the Nanjing University of Science and Technology or one of their high end. I mean, I like reciprocity. Diplomacy is all about reciprocity. If you get to do that, then I get to do that. And so we've taken a few steps on reciprocity in terms of diplomacy and media access, whose goal is not to kick Chinese journalists out of the U.S. It's to bring U.S. journalists back into the PRC after they were kicked out. So back to MILSA fusion, simply understanding and reading what they say. They're very clear about what they're intending to do. So read about it. There's been some good papers written about it from Elsa Kanya. She has some pretty good papers on that, and others. So you're simply understanding it, I think, is probably the best defense.
Super. I'm going to go ahead and run through about 3 questions here that I've got coming in from chat. There's a nice flow. I'll run through all of these, Secretary Stilwell, and then you can comment as you desire. One comes from Matthew Livers, and his question is, what age group do you believe this critical analysis of the media should start with? This gets into critical thinking. And what is your plan to get state curriculum development teams to take action to implement your changes? So that's one question. A second from Daniel Betancourt. He asks, can you describe some of the diplomatic initiatives abroad aimed at curbing Chinese Communist Party disinformation, especially considering the high level of diplomatic and economic outreach to the developing countries? So there's an angle there on developing countries. And a third question, just for comment, this is from Joe McGrath. In Oceania, where information can be difficult to disseminate, money speaks volumes. We can't outspend the Chinese, but as we attempt other avenues to engage the Pacific Island countries, where are we falling short and where are we succeeding? So if you'd like to comment on any of those 3.
The first one, I'll try to answer them all, but the first one for me is probably the best, I'm best suited to answer. Yeah, in my engagement with the Department of Education, I learned very quickly that they have probably not a lot of impact on injecting critical thinking into our schools, right? That's state and local get to do that, which is great. That's the nature of a republic. I do think, though, that through those, through DOE and others, we can at least sensitize schools, school boards, and the rest to the need to do this. We can also do it just by just straight outreach. What's the right age for that? I would imagine junior high school is a good place to start. My daughter, if you guys remember way back, maybe 8 years ago, there was a email thread going around on social media about this guy, Coney, some warlord in Africa. And I remember she was talking about him all the time, and I could see her typing and stuff. And then one day she just absolutely stopped talking about him. And what happened was she discovered it was a spoof. It was a disinformation campaign. I think it was an attempt to get people to send money to nefarious organizations not at all related to the subject. And so it was a really hard education for her that, it's a hard world out there and people don't always tell the truth. Hopefully we can show kids those slides I showed you where it looks right, and then you look a little bit closer and discover it wasn't really what it said it was. I'll give you an example. There was a piece on YouTube a couple days ago about the protests near the White House, and they were filming guys in masks, glasses, hoods. You couldn't see who was doing it, but they were throwing rocks and stuff like that. And then you hear somebody yell, "Zo, zo, zo," like "let's go" in Chinese. And the moment you see that, the hair on the back of your neck stands up. I go, "That's something not quite right." I think the intent was to make it look like somehow Chinese agent provocateurs were in the middle of all of the protests. So I think in general, you teach your kids from the beginning, you have to approach everything with a healthy skepticism, except for your parents. They're telling you the truth. You don't want to question what they're saying. Diplomatic initiatives in the developing world, as far as teaching misinformation or identifying that, I got to be honest. From what I'm seeing out of Africa, the Africa Bureau, the Chinese are doing a pretty good job. We talked about wolf warriors before. There's already healthy skepticism about the Chinese propaganda that's out there. You minimize people's ability to digest and understand these things at your own risk. The folks in Africa or any other India are just as witting, or even more so than we are. They probably are more so. They're probably more critical of what they see. And then as Oceania, you're right, that's an area of increasing competition with the PRC. But there are things that we can do that don't involve money. I like you say, I don't have any interest in getting into a bidding war with the PRC. There are countries out there that, in like topics like recognizing Taiwan, that flip-flop every 5 years, looking for the best bidder. Good on them, right? Get the best deal you can, but that panda has teeth and quickly bites. And so there's lots of stories of folks who've been discouraged or had their hopes let down. They were promised a lot. My favorite phrase, if you listen to the MFA spokesperson, you hear this all the time. China will continue to make steps to reform and open its economy for foreign businesses. They've said it so many times, and it's just continued to close. And so part of this misinformation is to listen for those same phrases and check that against action, words, deeds, and look for the disconnect. Over.
Super. And I've got a raised hand here from Ambassador Jane Hardy. Ambassador, we'll unmute you.
Thank you. Am I unmuted?
You are.
Hi. Great.
We can hear you.
Aloha, Mr. Stilwell. It's great to see you. And my question is similar to some of the others. I'm focused on Southeast Asia. I have a long history of working in Southeast Asia. And I've just seen another article by the Prime Minister of Singapore on the endangered Asian century. We have our Southeast Asian partners who have long played the balancing game with the big powers to their north, including both Japan and China. My question is, we've got, you talked about binary messaging and binary choices, which we should avoid getting into that trap. Well, the classic binary message or binary choice is the choice between economic progress or economic relationships and strategic interests. And Australia has long been, there have been many questions in the media over many decades actually about Australia balancing its need to engage with its Asian neighbours whilst maintaining the fundamental plank of the US alliance. And we always say we can do several things at once. It is not a binary choice, but for many, this question persists, that there's some kind of binary choice between economic development, investment, and so on. We're heading into the Southeast Asian talk fests of all the ASEAN meetings. I've worked on these myself in the past. My question is, in the social media world, in the mainstream media world, you are often reduced to sound bites and trite phrases and binary messages. But we have to somehow explain more clearly the work that goes on in all these multilateral settings, regional forums, and so on, and get messages out from those, which explains and demonstrates US and other like-mindeds' huge commitment to the region and all the quiet but important work we've been knitting together for many decades now. As a serving diplomat, it's a very hard thing to do, to actually create those messages in the modern way through social media. Would you care to comment on that? I've seen some wonderful examples of American social media, US government social media, but it is pretty hard to translate the complex work we do in, say, ASEAN meetings and get it out there to a CNN or a BBC headline.
Right. Yeah, Twitter's hard, and Twitter is not a good place to have an open dialogue, a public debate, because it's got to be tight and pithy, and it's usually reacting to something, so you can't really lead with that. Public statements are good. I'll tell you what, the thing I like best is visuals. Every culture has the same phrase, picture's worth 1,000 words, and an image of us doing what we do, and just Americans being American. In Timor-Leste, I saw a bunch of Navy Seabees building schools with like real latrines out there. Those are the things that actually make it out there. So you just simply put those on your page. Unfortunately, U.S. and how about foreign embassy web pages don't get quite the same splash as a headline out of the Straits Times or whatever. And so you're right. As I said, number one priority is messaging here and figuring out how to do it better. But I think a democracy like Australia and the U.S., just being ourselves and being visible and being present is half the battle. It's not everything. It's half the battle. Finally, on that binary choice, my Singapore colleague in Beijing when we were there, in exasperation one day says, I just got approached by the Chinese counterpart. And he says, what's wrong with Singapore? Are you pro-China or are you pro-US? He says, I'm pro-Singapore. I mean, I'm going to do it. It's the best deal and what makes sense for Singapore. And so as we do our messaging, we have to make sure they understand that what our intent is, and that the history, the record is good. Chinese messaging typically is very short-term. They'll say things that work in the short term, but if you hold them to those commitments in long term, it all falls apart. That's one thing we're trying to do right now.
I've got two back here on the chat side. I'm going to run through both of these. One from Congressman Ed Case asking, what, if anything, regarding China has been reset as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, or is it still too early to tell? That's one. And then one from President of East West Center, Richard Volstek. You mentioned the competition between systems, closed versus free and open. But China's taking advantage of open systems and using our free environment against us. Distribution of free newspapers, for example. Is one counter approach to demand more reciprocity from China, limit access to what they do to us, or what are other possibilities?
So Congressman Case, sir, I hope to see you here. Maybe someday we'll get together. It's great to see my representative in action. As far as what's changed, I think everything's changed. That's been the thing that broke the back. People want to believe the best. One of the great things I've learned in this job is I look around at who we are, open societies, and we believe the best in people. We're very self-critical, but we want to believe the best out of everybody else. And it's so hard to convince people that big fuzzy panda doesn't have the best of intentions. And so, but the Corona thing, it took a while. If you remember in February, they were doing their best to walk away from it and blame it on everybody, to include the US Army. You saw the response from that. And I do believe that it wasn't just the bureaucracy here in DC, but the US in general saw that and go, nah, we're not putting up with that. And so I think when the historians write that book, Jali Jian, at DCM in Pakistan, now the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesman, who decided to try to blame the US Army during the military games in October in Wuhan for bringing it, that changed the whole thing. I've had some great interactions with Congress lately on this, and they understand the job that needs to be done. As far as policy changes, I just think that we're thinking twice about this idea of engage to, for them to give back, or, if you treat them like an enemy, they'll act like an enemy. I think that is long gone, and people do recognize from the Chinese own words that this is a competition. Doesn't mean we're enemies, it just means we are competing, and we will continue to do so. And I look forward to working with you on that. As far as the East-West Center President's question, yes, it is definitely a competition. And our open system, if I can just give you a quick analogy, a quick story, anecdote. I was in charge of information warfare for the Air Force for a time when I was at Nellis. My job was to represent what an enemy would do with phishing, spear phishing, Trojans, and all this stuff. And as I looked at it, on the way from a meeting I had in Dayton, Ohio, I was sitting next to a guy, and we started talking. He turns out he works for Victoria's Secret, and he turns out he's the net manager. He's the network manager for the Victoria's Secret. So I asked him, how do you protect your system? He goes, it's perfect. Our system is flawless. He says, we don't plug in. We are an intranet. People on phones take orders and call them in, and then they're input into the system that way. And so I briefed that to Air Force leadership. I said, if we're getting our pockets picked here, that might be the way to go. And they, basically threw me out of the room. They go, if we do that, we've lost. We have to maintain it. We are, and we have to stay open. The downside, as we were talking about earlier, of putting everything you have behind the firewall means your MFA spokespeople don't understand what resonates in the real world. They don't understand that this thing you're saying doesn't make any sense, or it comes across as uninformed or ignorant. And so just that, in the short term, it doesn't work. In the long term, I think we're seeing, 10 years, 20 years into it, it's working out just fine. Thank you.
Secretary Stilwell, we're running close to the end of the clock here. If it's okay with you, I can take one last lightning round, maybe of 3 questions from some raised hands, if that's okay with you.
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, and I'm going to go for James Lee, Evan Sao, and Pete Gumatau. Please, I ask you, please make them as succinct as you can, and then we'll go to each of you in turn, and then we'll give the Assistant Secretary a chance to respond. So James Lee, over to you first.
Thank you so much. And I'm James Lee. I'm an adjunct fellow at the Pacific Forum. My question is, what do you think is going to be the future of Hong Kong, and how does that play a role in the strategic competition between China and the U.S.?
Super. Mercedes Trent. And if you could state your affiliation, please, and then your question.
Hi, I'm a research associate at the Federation of American Scientists. I just want to know, as we try to counter influence and Chinese disinformation, how do we still sort of maintain our own, so that we don't hamstring ourselves? How do we still maintain our own ability to work with Chinese graduate students who come here, Chinese researchers and scientists who come here? I know there have been some efforts to restrict visas for some of those people and things like that. So how do we not hamstring our own innovation while keeping our stuff safe?
Thanks, Mercedes. And last, Pete, coming in at the wire, Pete Gumatau.
Okay. Hey, you still there?
We're there. We hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Bob, for letting me in. And Stilly, aloha and alpha day. Hey, real quickly, I think this is a very informed audience you've been talking to and having this dialogue, and everybody understands the impacts on disinformation and shaping what's reality versus perception. But in terms of our fellow Americans here in the States, as we talk about this, do you think we're getting to them? You think we're connecting with the, I would say, average Joe bag of donuts regarding this is essentially a struggle between respect for sovereignty, individual liberty, free open markets versus this state authoritarian thing. Do you think these conversations that we're having in this venue that PAC Forum hosted, is actually starting to grow within pockets within our country? Because that's important in terms of that groundswell, right?
Super. Thank you.
Seeing you. Great tie, by the way.
I'll go backwards. The answer is no. I use my kids as a barometer, and things that like to me are like right here screaming they've never heard of it, and I think that's okay. Because as long as we ask them to approach everything with a healthy skepticism, that's probably success. Not every message has to resonate. And look, the audiences. Oftentimes we figure out who our audience is. Is our audience the free world? Is it Chinese people, or is it the Chinese government? So those are the three bins I put our messaging efforts into. I do things like this to get the word out to the people like you, who then can carry the message elsewhere. But you already know what I'm going to say. So, I'm selling water to a drowning man here. But I do think it will be important. It goes back to the party versus the people, though. I don't want people to dislike China or dislike Chinese people. That leads to all sorts of negative outcomes. But I do want them to understand what the intent of the Chinese Communist Party is. And they want, and show how they're trying to undermine the thing that they like, the fact that they can speak freely and don't have to self-censor, or suddenly their cost of something goes up. Like, for Australia, when they do the right thing, suddenly they stop importing Australian beef. I mean, there's bigger consequences. It's more at the national level, though, than at the individual level. Hong Kong, that's a tough one, but our initial instinct is to blame ourselves and look at the U.S. The U.S. is doing things to hurt Hong Kong, right? As we follow through in the Hong Kong Policy Act, Human Rights and Democracy Act, we, admit the fact that Hong Kong is no longer autonomous. They're going to say, yeah, U.S., you're hurting Hong Kong. We didn't do it. The Chinese government is the ones who are going to impose harsh national security laws, and they're saying it right now, even before they pass it. So let's make sure we identify the agency, who's responsible, and see if we can work with them to get them to soften their point. And the last one is engaging with students. This is disinformation. That's a great question, and it's a great example of disinformation. When you listen to MFA spokesman or word out of the PRC, they're saying the U.S. is cutting off all visas to all Chinese students. That is complete hokum. There's 360,000 Chinese students in the U.S. We're cutting off far less than even 1% of that. And these are, like I said earlier, these are folks like Pete and Bob and me, who are in uniform, whose job it is to understand what the other side's doing and building and taking that technology back and using it to their unfair advantage. So no, we're not cutting off. We're actually encouraging, and the visa rates are going up, by the way, on students. We're simply identifying those students that may be up to no good. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much for your time with us this evening. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. You're a busy man, and thanks for taking the time in your schedule. This session's been recorded. It's on the record. We'll have a copy of this available on our website, www.pacforum.org. And again, thanks to all, and to our well over 140, 150 participants that dialed in to join us today. Thanks again, Secretary Stilwell. Terrific mug, by the way.
See you out in the break.
You got it. Take care, everyone. Thanks again.
Thanks, Bob.